All right. Welcome, Martin. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us about debt sustainability analysis, a topic that, as you mentioned, is already pretty dominant in the global south because it's key for your fiscal policy. We in Europe are just learning about it. It's potentially going to become one of the key analytical tools for the European fiscal rules. So we're very, very happy to have you here as yet absolute expert on DSAs to explain to us what they are, how they work, what the pitfalls are. Maybe just 2 words on your background. You are the former Minister of the Economy from Argentina. You were minister by the age of 37, I think. You would not have been allowed to be the Bavarian Minister President. In my home state, you have to be 40 to take on such a responsible position. They clearly didn't think then could take on these jobs as you did. You negotiated debt restructuring in Argentina, very, very complex. So if anybody knows real life, these issues in real life, then it's you. You've also looked at debt sustainability analysis from an academic point of view. You're a visiting professor at Columbia, also professor in Argentina. So you're really bringing 2 worlds together, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you. And over to you for your input.
Thank you, Philippa, and thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to join this webinar on debt sustainability analysis. Indeed, a timely issue, particularly in the Southern Hemisphere. It's a hot topic, given what's been happening after COVID-19, after actually a sequence of 3 shocks, the 2008 financial crisis in the US and all the increase in global liquidity that entailed through quantitative easing, and then the COVID-19 that hit countries in the world after a decade of increasing indebtedness, and finally the war in Ukraine and the response, the monetary policy response from central banks from advanced economies with quantitative tightening and interest rate hikes. So the issue of debt sustainability is being highly debated and highly used, actually. So let me begin with a definition on debt sustainability. What's a debt sustainability analysis and why it matters? So any debt sustainability analysis has to respond to 2 questions. The first one is whether under certain circumstances, debt can be deemed sustainable with a high probability. And the second one, if the answer to the first question is that it's not sustainable, is what is the size of relief that a sovereign nation would need in order to restore that sustainability. And there is generally certain level of disagreement about the meaning of that sustainability. It means different things for different constituencies, for different stakeholders. For the debtor, it may mean the possibility of having the conditions for implementing a political and economic project for the development of a society. For certain group of creditors may mean something different, and for other creditors may also mean something different. So the very first question that arises at any analysis of that sustainability already creates disagreements. And what I want to do in my remarks is to distinguish the 2 key parts of any process of that sustainability analysis, which is the theory and the practice. Okay, so let me begin with the theory of that sustainability analysis. In order to respond those 2 questions of whether debt is sustainable and what are the characteristics of a debt operation that would be sufficient for restoring debt sustainability, we need a framework for debt sustainability analysis. And every framework for DSA has 3 key elements. The first one is the definition of the constraints that the debtor faces. including economic and political constraints. The obvious constraint for any analysis of public debt sustainability is the budget constraint of the public sector. But many countries are indebted in foreign currency. So when you write down the budget constraint of the public sector, given that there is debt in foreign currency, the exchange rate appears, meaning that the balance of payment constraints is also part of the set of relevant constraints in many cases for analyzing debt sustainability. And there may be other constraints as well, like there is certain level of activity below a threshold of economic activity that defines what's acceptable or unacceptable at a political level. A country may not be able to sustain an economy that performs too badly. So these economic and political constraints have to be defined, and this is one of the key elements over which there is disagreement in any analysis of debt sustainability. The second element of any debt sustainability analysis is the model that represents the economy and that accounts for the endogenous feedback effects associated with economic policies. We could say, well, a country can entail a policy of spending cuts in order to leave more space for debt repayment, but those spending cuts could be associated with fiscal multipliers that affect tax revenues and therefore affect the shape and the state of the budget constraint of the public sector. So typically, the objects that enter into the economic constraints that define debt sustainability are what we call mathematically fixed points, meaning that the fiscal surplus is a transformation of itself. It depends on the policies that are implemented. And having a clear view of the macroeconomic multipliers associated with macroeconomic policies is a crucial issue in debt sustainability analysis. And we've seen in the context of the European countries in the 2010s, the problems that arose when the IMF was using multipliers that were too low, like as it happened for Greece, for Portugal, and later on work from the IMF research department, including from Olivier Blanchard and Ley, acknowledging that multipliers were much larger than the ones that had been used in the models for debt sustainability analysis. But this is a typical problem in any discussion about debt sustainability. And the third element for the framework for debt sustainability analysis is the choice, the definition of distributions of shocks. And there can clearly be different beliefs about what's the PDF, the probability density function that governs the shocks to which an economy is exposed. And this also matters for the practice of debt sustainability analysis, which I will turn to now. So in the global economy, what's the common practice for debt sustainability analysis? Mainly from the 80s, but even more strongly in the 90s, the IMF has taken a key role or a critical role in process of sovereign debt restructuring and when it comes to analyzing debt sustainability. So during the period between the Second World War and the end of Bretton Woods, there were almost no sovereign debt crisis in the world. There was one case in Brazil, 1963. But after the OPEC crisis, we saw an increasing number of crises, particularly in Latin America and also in Eastern Europe, and an increasing role for the IMF when it came to providing a contour, a perimeter for what a debt restructuring should achieve. And the IMF does that through its frameworks for debt sustainability analysis. It's like the informal referee, although it's also a part many times of this process because it's a creator of most of the countries that are having a debt crisis or that have had debt crisis over the last about 40 years. The governments should have their own departments or divisions for producing that sustainability analysis, but most of them, virtually every government, lacks the capacity for producing that sustainability analysis. I would tell you that Argentina is probably the only country that has ever done that sustainability analysis in the context of a debt negotiation. Most governments don't even have the human resources to do that, and they don't have the frameworks for that. So that matters because they get at a disadvantage with respect to the other creditors if they don't have an analysis of that sustainability. And creditors don't present that, private creditors don't present that sustainability analysis. They never, so there is no revelation of what was the debt payment, the definition of debt payment capacity that was being assumed when originally there was a debtor-creditor transaction that included a risk premium. So the risk premium, in a world of incomplete contracts, is supposed to compensate for the fact that there will be circumstances in which the debtor won't be able to make the transfer to the creditor, but it's nowhere written what is the definition of the constraints that says, okay, in this region, the debtor is supposed to pay, but in this other region of the PDF of shocks, the debtor is not supposed to make the transfer. So at the end, the DSA is also a bit of a political, not a bit, it's a political process that involves negotiations. The IMF produces that sustainability analysis in the context of negotiations towards an IMF program or under a program. But there is no rule that says that it's a precondition for the IMF to produce that sustainability analysis, although it's very uncommon to see the IMF producing that sustainability analysis when a country is negotiating with its creditors if the country is not under an IMF program. The exception to that was Argentina in 2020. I will just spend 1 minute because this is a relevant anecdote for what the European Commission may face with the member nations. Argentina in 2020, when we were negotiating with our private creditors a debt restructuring to restore that sustainability, the government requested a debt sustainability analysis from the IMF, which was also a major creditor for the country. And initially the IMF said, no, we can't do it because Argentina is no longer under an IMF program. The previous program from 2018 had been derailed, and the IMF staff claimed initially that they wouldn't be able to know what the policy parameters were because Argentina was not under an IMF program, even though Argentina is a sovereign nation that was defining its own economic policy, which was the response of the government. We tell you what our policies will be, and you feed your model with those parameters. And it was a negotiation, and the IMF ended up doing it, which is the first time it was done. It's called the standalone analysis of that sustainability. And it revealed that member countries can resort to the IMF and request outside of a program an analysis of that sustainability. And I make this point because I truly think it will matter for the dynamic that European countries may face with the European Commission when it comes to the practice of that sustainability analysis. One final remark that I want to make before we enter into a Q&A. When a debt sustainability analysis is produced, we have to, as we discussed before in the part of the theory, we have to make assumptions about the distributions of the shocks. And the fact that there is an institution, say the IMF or the European Commission, producing a debt sustainability analysis is a recognition that we don't think markets are efficient. Because if we were thinking markets were efficient, there would be no need for a debt sustainability analysis. We would simply use the market risk premium. And that would be the measure of that sustainability. So then, what's the issue for the institution that is producing the DSA? The issue is that it has to define what interest rate is using in the analysis of that sustainability. meaning that it has to have its own assumptions about the distributions of shocks that in turn will determine the probability of repayment, given the definition of constraints and given the model that represents the workings of the economy. And a typical problem at the moment of producing a sustainability analysis is how do we incorporate the information from the market, and to what extent the analyst, the one producing the sustainability analysis, differentiates from the views that prevail in the market. And that's important because if the institution that is producing the analysis, the DSA, uses the market interest rate when it has a different belief about the distribution of shocks, it will be reproducing a situation that from the market viewpoint may be a situation of disequilibrium. So it may lead to a self-fulfilling process. It may reproduce a situation of disequilibrium by the way it creates that sustainability analysis. And that's even more important if those DSAs are used as a lending tool, as it's the case with the IMF, right? Because it determines under what risk conditions the institution will lend, and it may affect the interest rate at which the country lends. So I will stop with my initial remarks here, and I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I think we'll get to that interest rate discussion, which has been a non-discussion in Europe, surprisingly enough. But I think there's a lot to be talked about. While you all gather your thoughts, and feel free to post questions, I'll just very briefly outline how DSAs are going to be used in Europe, so we all have a bit of context on that. So the idea is to use that sustainability analysis over 14 to 17 years. So this is one thing I think we need to discuss, whether you can run DSAs over such a long time horizon. Normally with the fund, they're done to over 5 years, something like that. 14 to 17 years out, to define what kind of fiscal development we need in the next 4 years, and that's specified as an expenditure path, to have a falling debt to GDP ratio in the medium to long term. So the EU Commission wants to do these very long run analysis to then say for the next 4 years, national governments need to stick to a certain expenditure path, which, I mean, de facto means that your national budget will have a ceiling for 4 years, which is in Europe quite a big thing, given that everybody thinks we're still sovereign nation states where parliament decides over the budget. As it stands in the current legislative proposal, but I think this is one of the issues to be discussed, the EU Commission has pretty much all the rights to say what kind of methodology will be used for the DSA, what kind of assumption, what kind of fiscal multipliers, how investment and reforms will be accounted for. And if national governments use different assumptions, they have to explain and justify to the Commission why their assumptions are more plausible than the Commission wants. Interestingly enough, if they can't agree, in doubt, the Commission is right. So some quite strong assumptions on this. On Martin's last point on interest rates, it's quite interesting because the European fiscal rules came about because one didn't trust the market, and one thought that it wasn't a good idea to rely on the market because it can, you know, have these random fluctuations of confidence where suddenly all confidence goes away and then overreacts the market, and then you get a debt crisis, which you didn't want. That's outlined quite specifically in the Delors report. So the Delors report said, for that reason, we want fiscal rules to have smoother, less risky policy. So that's the whole justification for having fiscal rules. Now, in the debt sustainability analysis, the EU Commission is so far using market interest rates and planning to use them going forward. So while on the one hand we say we don't trust the market to have an accurate judgment, and this is why we need fiscal rules, we then in the implementation use market interest rates to define, to calculate the debt to GDP ratio, and especially for high debt countries, that, you know, can make quite a big difference. Italy, the spread goes up, your debt explodes, spread goes down, it all looks quite feasible. So that's one of the issues I'm particularly curious about, what Martin thinks about this, but I see there are lots of questions coming in. So I'll stop here and start with working on those. So maybe one that popped up right at the beginning, Martin, when you talked a lot about fiscal multipliers and how important they are. One question is, they vary a lot across countries, they change over time. Downturns, they're very different. I mean, they're probably also related to what happens to monetary policy. So what are we going to do with this in Europe? How do you standardize them? Can you do that? And if not, what else do you do?
Okay. So, Filba, you want me to begin now, or should we get a few questions all together?
No, we start and I'll just work them down.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, very interesting comments on the discussions that are taking place regarding the role of the European Commission. Point number one, the issue of fiscal multipliers. We do have good empirical work on the issue of fiscal multipliers, and I think it will be important for the work of the Commission to be thoughtful about tracking the evidence, not just tracking the evidence, but every case is different, and we live in a non-stationary world, and this is very true. Now we are seeing the kind of shocks that the economy is going through, and there will be continuous recalibration of this analysis about the impact of fiscal multipliers. But it will be an important issue. The typical discussion with private creditors is that they say, if you do, in the context of a recession, if you follow a policy of fiscal contractions, a contraction in fiscal policy, that is going to create confidence, and the market, being more confident, will provide financing under better conditions. There will be a decrease in the interest rate, and that's what's going to enable economic growth. And we see case after case that when countries do that, that's not really the outcome. Situations get worse. That's what's called the too little and too late problem in the economics literature, in the sovereign debt literature. When countries in the context of a recession are just too optimistic about the virtues of contraction and fiscal policy, they just fail. They end up having a deeper recession, and eventually they end up having a restructuring, but from a worse, from a situation that is worse than before. It will be important not to repeat the mistakes during the Greek crisis when it comes to the definition of assumptions about fiscal multipliers. The second reaction is with respect to what happens if the assumptions from the European Commission and the countries are different on the DSA. That's where I think it's so important for each country to have its own framework for debt sustainability analysis, a well-defined framework in which we can see where the differences lie exactly between the institution that is producing the debt sustainability analysis and the country. Let me tell you an anecdote. In 2020, when we were engaging with the IMF to have a debt sustainability analysis, so at the same time, Argentina's government and the IMF were producing the sustainability analysis, and in the first discussion that we had to compare notes, they look quite different. And at the end, the day they were published, they look pretty much, they were quite similar. They were pretty much the same. And why was that? In part because, of course, there are political issues behind those kind of outcomes. But on the technical side, the fact that Argentina had its own debt sustainability analysis did matter, because we could compare one by one where were the differences in assumptions. And most countries can't do that because they just don't have a framework. So the fact that if each European country has its own framework, I think it will be at an advantage with respect to what's the norm for having more chances of achieving common ground. Maybe not, but I think it's more likely if there is a framework for the sustainability analysis at the government level. The final point, the interest rates, and your comment, Philippe, on the European Commission using market interest rates. How do I see that? The situation is different for countries that have market access versus those that don't have market access. If you have market access, at the moment, the country refinances, rollovers the debts at the market interest rate, and for the period of analysis, there has to be an important weight to the market interest rate, because that's a moment in which, because that's a rate at which you are refinancing your debts. But in the future, markets may just not be, you don't know in a year from now if the market today will be correct about the future interest rate. So there is no reason why the analyst, in this case, European Commission or the IMF, should fully respect the market interest rate. And if it does that, there will be no point in doing a DSA. That's the point. And by doing that, the DSA will be reproducing the market outcome that may actually be leading to an unsustainable debt position. So the mere existence of a debt sustainability framework at an institution like the IMF, or in this case, for the case of our discussion, the European Commission, means that the institution has to make a decision that may not be the market decision about what's the path of interest rates that is going to be used. If the country has no market access, then the market interest rate is not even relevant for the period of analysis, because the whole point of a DSA is to define conditions under which the country would be able to restore to access to international credit markets and refinance those debts after a debt operation. So the market interest rate should not be relevant, because what we want is a DSA that tells us after this debt operation, then debt will be sustainable, and what will be the rate that is consistent with debt sustainability. So in that case, in none of the periods under analysis, the market interest rate should be used.
Maybe just a quick follow-up question on this one, because I think in Europe we have quite a special regime. I mean, all market access countries, but we borrow in our own common currency. And what the risk premium is, in a way, depends a lot on the institutional setup, right? One of our colleagues, who I think isn't online because he's currently doing an internship at the IMF, just wrote a paper on risk premium and what drives them in Europe. And there basically were no risk premium until, I think it was 2005, when the collateral framework of the ECB accepted all European government with the same haircut / no haircut. And then afterwards they started differentiating, and then we start to get risk premium. So I mean, this is all pretty endogenous. It's very obvious to me why you should reflect risk premium that you as country can't do much about, because you're borrowing in foreign currency at some rate that is exogenous, is given to you. But we in Europe can change these rates if we want to. So it sometimes seems like shooting yourself in the foot if you drive these risk premium without a good reason, make it impossible for a country to reduce their debt and create self-fulfilling prophecies.
That's the classical problem of multiple equilibria. You can have a country in which faces a low interest rate, and another one that faces a high interest rate, both of them with exactly the same macroeconomic conditions, exactly the same debt stock. For one of them, that might be sustainable, for the other is unsustainable. But if the perception was that that was sustainable for the country that has interest rate, and therefore the interest rate was lower, then that will be sustainable. That's why this issue of how a policy institution manages the issue of definition of the PDF of shocks and the interest rate matters. because it can reproduce situations of disequilibrium, but also it matters as a policy tool. It tells you, well, ultimately what the European Commission should want is that debts become sustainable. And the point is, how do we ensure that the interest rate is low? Not how do we just keep attached to the view of the financial markets that today are discounting debts at a high rate, and therefore the interest rate is high today. And therefore that makes that unsustainable. So that's a key definition. From the viewpoint of a policy institution, that's a key definition.
Yeah, yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
The IMF doesn't use the market interest rates.
We saw that when we reviewed it, because I mean it looked slightly odd to us in the European definition whether anybody else does that. And I mean the IMF I think says something like expert judgment, which could probably be anything, but certainly prevents you from having self-fulfilling prophecies. Going back a little bit to your point about every country should do their own DSA and then converge with the Commission. In Europe, we also have pretty different capabilities in governments. I mean, sometimes by wealth and size, but also just take the Netherlands. I mean, they've been doing DSAs for ages. They have a huge independent fiscal institution. Other countries don't have that. So do you think there's a risk if it in the end, comes down to political negotiation and whoever has more DSA soldiers on their side gets a better deal? There's a risk of uneven treatment.
Well, I think that risk happens by definition. Every debt negotiation is a political negotiation, and every analysis that looks like purely technical, it's not really purely technical. There is behind, even the framework is to some extent the outcome of a political process. So from the viewpoint of countries here, the point is how to ensure themselves because we face an international architecture, and this we could make a parallelism with Europe, but at the global level we face an international architecture in which we have sovereign nations, but that have to interact in a globalized economy in the context of an architecture that gives an important role to international financial institutions, of which the sovereign nations are members, and they may be even debtors of those institutions. And at the end, understanding that the outcomes will be the consequence of political processes, countries can ensure themselves, but by having frameworks that allow them to have a more balanced relationship with those institutions, as in this case with the European Commission.
This might be the right time to ask a question on how your negotiations with the IMF went in detail. I mean, as much as you can talk about it, how should we picture this? They come in with their DSA, you sit there with your DSA, and then it's like one assumption for the other, or how did this go?
Okay. So first, there is a definition of the sequence of negotiations with different groups of creditors. In the case of Argentina, we had 3 groups of creditors. The 2 big ones were the private creditors and the IMF. Argentina had started the crisis in 2018. So in 2016, Argentina reaccessed international credit markets, and it started to borrow large amounts in a world of 0 interest rates at an average rate of 7% in US dollars. And only 2 years later, expectations changed in April 2016, when the Fed increases the interest rate for the first time in a long time. Emerging markets are tested, and 2 countries did not pass the test, Argentina and Turkey. And by then, Argentina resorted again to the IMF. Argentina had paid the IMF in full in 2005. It had no debt with the IMF. And the IMF approved the largest loan in its history, $50 billion, that was then increased to $57 billion, out of which $45 billion were disbursed, which made the IMF the largest creditor of the country. And the third group of creditors were the Paris Club creditors, which was just a small fraction of the debt of the country. And we had to define the sequence. Typically, countries restructure debt with private creditors in the context of an IMF program. And history tells us that things don't work well for them. It's what the literature calls it too little and too late. Argentina suffered those problems in the 80s. We had capital payment, we had payments with creditors coming due in 2020 when we started the negotiations, and we didn't have any payments with the IMF, capital amortization payments coming due until September 2021. So we started the negotiations with the private creditors first, which is the different way to what's common. And that did matter for the practice of debt sustainability analysis. So that's why Argentina requested, not in the context of a program, an analysis of debt sustainability from the fund, and the fund ended up doing it. As I told you before, initially they did not want to do it. How were those negotiations? Well, there were different stages. The DSA is one part of the negotiation, and the IMF analysis of debt sustainability was helpful for the negotiations. And this is something I think it must be taken into account in the context of what happens today in Africa, or what might happen in Europe in the future to some economies. One of the key problems in any debt negotiation for the negotiator is the domestic political economy problem. And I'm going to explain why the IMF DSA helped. The domestic political economy problem simply means that governments don't want to restructure the debts when they are unsustainable. It's just too costly. And also there are vested interests. There is campaign financing for campaigns, political financing from creditors or some of the creditors. Some of the creditors are important players in the domestic economy. When you look at the evidence over the last 40 years, you're going to have a hard time finding a debtor that wants to start a debt restructuring on time. The fact that the IMF produced a debt sustainability analysis that said debt is unsustainable, it has to be restructured, and the debt operation to restore that sustainability has to be deep, helped the negotiators to deal with the domestic political economy problem. So it was good to have the IMF on the left, right? It's like being on the left of the domestic political spectrum, because it's very difficult to be to the left of the IMF. So that's one sense in which this analysis can help debtors that are negotiating with private creditors. I think the situation in Europe is going to be different, markedly different than the situation that countries from the global south are facing today. The number of Ghana, Zambia, Laos, Suriname, Egypt, I could go on, and it's actually a large number of countries are under the distress. That's not what Europe is facing right now. But these frameworks at multilateral institutions could help. Then, Filipa, there's another part of the negotiation, that is the negotiation with the IMF for refinancing the debt with the IMF. But I think I can leave that aside because it's not the core of what we're discussing today.
Key issue of the debate. One thing a lot of people are curious about is during the negotiations with the creditors, who do you talk to? How do you know who the big private holders of your debt are?
Oh, great question. Great question. There is a problem of lack of transparency. When you look at the G20 communiques over the last few years, you're going to see that in every communique in the finance track, there is a footnote about transparency. So all what matters in the G20 communiques is really in the footnotes, right? It's when there is no agreement. And it's credit countries asking for transparency about the debts with China, which is an issue. But transparency is even worse on the other side. So the creditors, most of the times, the private creditors know virtually everything about the debtor. In some countries, they may not know what the debts with China are. That's not the case in Argentina because we have a public registry of our debts. But almost every, I would say in every of these negotiations, the debtor doesn't know who their creditors are. We had to, the private creditors, because you make a primary issuance and then those bonds are traded in secondary markets, and we don't know, the debtor doesn't know whether creditors are protected through sovereign credit default swaps, such that it might be even in the benefit of the creditor to experience a default. So you don't know what the incentives of the other side of the negotiation actually are. In Argentina, we had to hire an informational agency, an international informational agency, to learn about our base of creditors. We knew some, so we had some knowledge about our creditors, but definitely far from having full knowledge. And even after hiring this international company, we only got to know a fraction of the our base of creditors. I mean, we knew who they were, but we didn't really know what was a fraction of bonds that each of them was holding. So that's a problem for the negotiations. And you have to face that reality. And that's one of the problems that contribute to unbalanced negotiations between the debtor and its private creditors, and to the deficient outcomes that we've been observing for 4 decades in these processes.
In Europe, there's been quite a big discussion on whether one should not have a home bias in holders of debt. So in Italy, domestic banks hold a lot of the debt, and institutions like the ECB or I guess the European Commission don't really like that, because then they think, oh, you can get a domestic doom loop. I'd imagine if I was the government, I would much rather have my local banks hold the debt than some foreigner I don't really know and I find very hard to deal with. Should governments actively think about who holds their debt?
It's important for governments to know who holds their debt. Yes, absolutely. In the case of Europe, I don't remember, I think it was 2011, but you correct me if I'm wrong, Europe prohibited naked sovereign credit default swaps. And that moved trade to elsewhere. But it's definitely important for the debtor to know who the holders are, who the bondholders are. And in any domestic or international architecture for debt, it would be important to account for the transparency factor. And you may tell us whether the European Commission is doing something in this respect, and if not, it would be an important issue for the defining of frameworks for dealing with debts in Europe.
Yeah. Interesting question. I'm not sure I know the answer, but I think a little bit of it, because we had the question when we froze Russia's reserve assets, to what extent they were invested in government bonds in Europe, and we couldn't quite tell. Moving on to a different topic, we have 2 questions on shocks and scenarios. So one question is, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of a stochastic versus a scenario-based DSA approach? And in Europe, they're planning on doing both. And the second one is, could you go into a bit more detail on the PDFs on shock distribution and its implications? What kind of distributions do you usually see? Does the central limit theory matter?
Okay, I'm not quite sure I understood the second question.
It's about shock distribution and to what extent they're independently distributed. I guess shocks are much nastier than in nice statistics.
Yeah, absolutely. So with respect to the first one, a scenario-based approach is also a form of doing stochastic analysis. So you define different scenarios. And that's just done, in my view, because of tractability. That's it, right? And that's how the IMF does it. So it's a high risk, medium risk, low risk, and so ultimately any analysis of that sustainability is of an stochastic nature by definition, because there are shocks. The issue is how we deal with them. On the second question, yeah, shocks may not be IID. And this is an important factor in any analysis of that sustainability. Today, one of the key discussions for modeling shocks is how we deal with climate change, which is affecting the distributions of shocks. And also, it has implications for the curve of carbon pricing, the intertemporal curve of carbon pricing. And that matters for element number 2 in a framework for that sustainability analysis, which is the choice of the model that represents the economy, and how you account for how climate change is going to affect the competitiveness of economies that do not adapt their structures of production. So you see this interaction between shocks and choice of the model as well. A model that represents the endogenous feedback effects that are associated with macro policies. What I want to say on this regard, and this is related to I think I missed one of your comments, Felipe, in your first set of comments, which is the time horizon that a DSA looks at. And by definition, a DSA looks at an infinity time horizon, but we discount time. And we don't know, we don't have the world evolves. Distributions are evolutionary distributions of shocks. So any DSA exercise has to recognize that there is a degree of ignorance, and that the exercise needs to be continuously adapted, continuously recalibrated. By definition, because the distributions of shocks change, or our perception of distributions of shocks change.
That isn't a question on the chat, but since Vincent and myself are discussing this issue a lot, and you raised it, how do we do DSAs in times of, I mean, not only climate change, but massive, and if it all goes well, unprecedented transformation? I mean, it requires that you have some kind of model of your economy that is so constant that you can use it over a couple of years, right? And I mean, first of all, we have pretty constraining climate targets in Europe. And secondly, we do think that the structures of our economy are going to change quite significantly. Interestingly enough, in the proposal of the Commission, all of this doesn't happen, it's not present. If you were to approach this problem, how would you think about it?
Well, we know that the predictive value of a DSA when uncertainties larger is lower, right? So it has lower predictive value. That's why it's also, we know that it's more difficult to define the distributions of shocks in times of larger uncertainty. But one element that could be incorporated at a larger scale in debt contracts is the contingency element, contingent debt contracts. Again, we cannot define the entire distribution of shocks. We cannot write complete contracts by definition, because we don't live in the Arrow de Blue world in which the what we call the space of states of nature is fixed. We don't live in that world. We live in a world that evolves. But we can do better than we do. And ultimately, the adoption of contingency clauses in that contracts requires market acceptance. There is good academic work that shows that these contracts would improve that sustainability. But still, there is lack of market acceptance, and therefore, for debtor countries, it may just not be valuable to issue contingent debt contracts, because you may just be issuing something that pays off in the upside scenarios, but for which you get no gain if markets do not give any value to those elements at the moment you issue the contract. That's a situation that I faced in Argentina when I led the restructuring of Argentina's public debt in 2020. You know, for a long time I had been writing about contingent debt contracts and the virtues of contingent debt contracts, and then I decided not to issue any contingent debt contract because markets did not give any value to these elements. So it would have entailed a high effort to the country in the upside scenarios for nothing. But it would certainly, if there was market acceptance, this will help us to deal with the uncertainty we're facing today. Particularly when there is no system for restructuring the debts. It makes the so you already include the restructuring within the contract for some states.
Why were investors not interested?
Well, that's part of the mystery. It's not really clear why. So there are different elements are put on the table. One is that these markets will be liquid, but that's only if there is adoption at a low scale, right? If there was a large scale adoption of these instruments, then the market should be more liquid and the instruments should price better. Yeah. Then there are arguments about the verifiability of shocks, but there is good work about this. Every of these concerns that have been raised by market participants can actually have a response from the viewpoint of how to design the contracts. But yeah, that's a bit of a mystery.
We're coming to the end of the time, so I definitely want to raise one more issue, which you already touched upon a little bit, which is endogeneity. So we have two questions on growth projections. What would a DSA look like if potential output was endogenous? I think you agree it is endogenous. And then second question, what's your view on the growth assumptions that go into DSAs? And should they be adjusted for policy choices?
Okay, so the typical mistake or the typical problem in DSAs is the over-optimism or the growth of the economy. That was Greece, right? Like there was the contraction in fiscal policies that were being pushed for Greece were associated with the perception that the economy will recover quickly. And then what was IMF doing in its world economic outlook year after year? Revising growth downwards, but changing the intercept and not the slope year after year. So always overestimating the debt payment capacity. That's what happens when you are too optimistic about economic growth. That famous case for Greece is the norm. Most of the countries that enter financial markets for the first time in 2008 are small countries in Africa or the Caribbean. No one pays attention to the details of what's going on, or just not no one, but not the global community. Definitely, that's probably a fair statement. But it's important to be sound about growth assumptions, and that's why the issue of endogenous feedback effects is so important. And the same happens for the potential growth, including the endogenous feedback effects associated with structural policies that affect the structure of the economy. And many times the models don't get that right. The DSAs have been evolving also at the IMF in the recent past. What the IMF was doing was to match moments, right? So how was the IMF choosing growth assumptions? By matching the moments of distributions that representing data from the past. And that's a problem. That's a problem because that data may have nothing to do with the future, especially if you are implementing policies that change the structure of the economy. You have a different structure. So the structure you are using is a structure from the past that is no longer relevant. Greece in the past was growing, but clearly the crisis reveals that that model is not really a good representation of the economy. And the same with many, like Argentina as well, many of the countries that go through this process. So that's why the representation or the choice of assumptions and the modeling for growth is that important.
Final question, if you had any advice for Europe on, implementing a DSA regime, what should one really think about very carefully? What would that advice be? And it can be very short and it can be long.
Okay, so I think it's important to learn. I would pay attention to, for the good and the bad part, to what's been happening with the IMF DSA over the last 40 years. On the one hand, the fact that the discussion that we had on the interest rate, I think that's an important one. If you're going to do a DSA, the fact that you're doing it is a recognition that you assume markets are not efficient. So be careful with how you form your assumptions about expectations and therefore about interest rate, especially when you are a policy institution that is supposed to contribute to the stabilization of the member countries. So that's one. And the IMF has gone through that process, and it doesn't use market interest rates as they are. They just don't take them for good. The other piece of advice is about how the framework is built. These three dimensions that constitute the framework: the constraints, the mold for the represents economy, and distributions of shocks. And I will advise each country to have its own framework as well. And therefore, they will have more capacity to compare notes with the European Commission.
Final question, because I'm being told off by the team to abuse the final question, is do you have any book recommendation? And it doesn't have to be related to what we're talking about. What's the best book you've read in recent times?
Oh, any book. Well, that's interesting because I'm going to confess I'm writing now a book on this.
What's it about?
I teach at the university a course called Sovereign Debt and Power Dynamics. And, because sovereign debt is also an issue of international politics, but it also includes all the technical part that relates to sovereign debt. And I use, of course, multiple sources. And this question, I should probably think more. It's probably easier at the moment to think of papers rather than books. The IMF tried to, the IMF did publish a book, a guide for practitioners, which is quite interesting. But I'm sure there's more work to do and build on what's already been done. So if the book has to be about DSA, I think
it can be about anything.
About anything, any kind of book. Well, let me then suggest a book from, I work a lot with Joe Stiglitz, and I think he's a giant of the field of economics. So let me refer to his later book on people, power, and profits, because it also illustrates some of the problems. It's mostly at the US level, but it draws lessons for understanding power dynamics at the international level. And that matters a lot for sovereign debt as well.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for that recommendation. I think Joe Stiglitz is pretty popular here. Thank you also for your time. That was incredibly insightful. Doesn't make me a lot less scared of DSAs coming to Europe and how we're going to handle all of this. But yeah, good luck with your book, and thank you everybody else for joining and for asking that many questions. Sorry we didn't get through all of them. Have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Have you all a good evening.